This is Duke University.
All right, welcome everyone. Since class just finished, some people might be straggling in, so as you come in, just go ahead and take a seat. Welcome to the Leading Edge Seminar Series. We have Travis Bradford here today, which is very exciting, to talk about Beyond Subsidies, the future of distributed energy finance. Really excited to have him talk about that today. We are streaming live, so there are people tuning in, which is very cool, and this is also going to be documented and stored on Leading Edge website for people to watch. We are doing this during class time, so we are missing a few people for corporate finance and some other courses, but thanks for getting here, and we're excited to get going. So when I sat down with Travis to talk about doing an event, we talked about doing a solar event, and I wanted to look at what was innovation in solar right now. And when I think of innovation, I often make a similar mistake that a lot of people do. I automatically think of technology, and that therefore efficiency, polar, PV efficiency, things like that. And Travis said the innovation right now is in finance. So right now with energy, and distributed energy especially, that's what we need to look at for the future. So I'm really excited for this event. I think it's a really hot topic right now, and excited to hear Travis talk about it. So Travis is the president and founder of the Prometheus Institute for Sustainable Development. And from the Prometheus, it's a nonprofit organization focused on harnessing the power of the business sector to develop cost-effective and sustainable solutions and technologies, including energy, water, food, and recycling. An incredible organization. The Prometheus Institute helped launch Green Tech Media and started the Carbon War Room. That was a partnership with Richard Branson to start that. Travis also is a managing partner at Atlas Capital Investments. It's a global hedge fund dedicated to sustainable technology companies, investing in sustainable technology companies. He also consults for governments, nonprofits, and corporations on strategy, and he lectures at Booth. He also lectures at Columbia, the School of International Public Affairs, and he also lectures here at Fuqua. If you haven't taken this class and you're not a second year and you have another year here, you should definitely take this course, Energy Markets and Innovations, next year. Before here, he went to Georgia State, got his MBA at Stern, also got a degree at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and also worked at the Federal Reserve. So in other words, he knows what he's talking about. So we're excited to have Travis, and I'm going to let you begin.
Thank you. Thanks, Colin, for the invitation to do this. It's a good opportunity for me, in particular, to talk about some stuff that is sort of at the edge of the things that I'm thinking about. And thanks, Dan, for all of Edge's work to sponsor these types of events. It's great to be here. So for those of you who don't know the funny aspect of the title of the talk, the Solar Finance Revolution, I also wrote a book called Solar Revolution, published by MIT Press, and as some of my ex-students like to remind me, I like to milk as much out of that as I possibly can. But to which my response is, it's still right. So as long as it continues to be right, I'll continue to mention it. When it stops being right, I'll probably stop mentioning it. But the solar revolution predicted a radical, non-linear transformation in the way our global industrial energy base is structured. And it did so based on an exceedingly small number of principles relating to the drop in distributed generation costs versus the traditional sort of centralized energy generation that was transmitted through a large natural monopoly transmission and distribution system to the end users. In a transformation very similar to of decentralization, very similar to what we've seen in computers and telecommunications, and that this was basically using the same technologies, but within the energy sector. So I made a number of predictions in the book. Many of them turned out to be true and accurate. to at least 2 or 3 decimal places about the evolution of the cost structure of doing this. But some of the assumptions that went into it also sort of revolved around the notion that eventually capital markets would figure out efficient ways to allocate the costs of things over their appropriate life and over their appropriate risk characterizations, and so that there was in essence there was a finance solution that would go along with the technical solution, and the combination of these two would lead to this sort of nonlinear shift in the way we harness energy. And so certainly those are both proceeding apace, but what I really want to focus on is the second half of that. And I want to think a lot about, because particularly in the United States, but also around the world, we've had this sort of evolution around finance that, as this market matures, that hasn't necessarily progressed from, say, inefficient small scale to efficient large scale in a linear way. And I want to talk through some of those twists and turns, because I think we're in the throes, particularly in the United States, particularly due to some of the tax characteristics of the support mechanisms for solar in the United States. We're at a place where we're about to see another twist happen in this marketplace. I think it's important for all of us to get ahead of it, because twists are they're both an opportunity to get ahead of the curve, if you will, and also opportunities to get thrown off in the wrong direction if you continue down the same trajectory. So did a little bit of background on the Prometheus Institute. It's a nonprofit research institute that has essentially spawned tons of market research. Much of that became the core of what is now Green Tech Media. When I spun it out into a for-profit entity that with some partners who'd set that up, and it has continued to grow and become, I think, a credible source of information in the space, particularly in solar, but now much wider and right on everything from smart grid to we have a smart grid event coming up near here sometime soon. Electric vehicles, biofuels, the gamut. The Carbon War Room I started with Richard Branson and Jigar Shah. Jigar was the former CEO and founder of the company called SunEdison. SunEdison plays a very heavy role in this solar finance innovation space, which we'll talk about in a minute for those of you who may or may not know him. The Institute continues to do a lot of work around the latest and greatest in innovation in these sectors, and as I said, I think finance is the current place where innovation needs to occur very quickly, and but also working on an understanding of not just the electric sector but the transportation sector. Working on another book with MIT Press on the future of the transportation sector, among many other projects that are resident somewhere in the ecosystem. All right, so let's talk about what the problem is that we're really looking at, and before we start talking about the possible solutions. So, energy finance, particularly sort of new energy finance, or emerging energy finance, or non-traditional energy finance. In many ways, it can look like traditional energy finance, but let's talk about some of the characteristics. First, you need to think about what's the technology being financed. And there's a lot of emerging technologies, and each of them is at a different scale of deployment. Each of them has different project sizes and different project characteristics. And I really want to, we'll talk about this in a second, I really want to think about just the finance of new installations of technologies. We're not talking about venture capital, we're not talking about private equity, except insofar as the private equity goes to support the deployment of actual installations. This is a unique aspect of, among all of those high-tech industries that perhaps have been spawned by venture capital or corporate venturing in the last 2 or 3 decades that we're very familiar with. This need for large-scale asset finance is one of the unique characteristics of the energy sector in achieving the necessary scale of deployment and the resulting cost reductions from that scale. So we need to think about about just the deployment phase, the asset finance phase, if you will, of these technologies, and each of these will have different characteristics. Like I said, different risk characteristics, capacity factors, sizes, development, and risk parameters around the underlying technology and its performance, lifetime. All of those things that go into thinking about it are going to be different for these different technologies. Again, the size of installation matters. It turns out I was thinking through all of the technologies in the first line, and I realized that all of them could be done at both the centralized and distributed scale. I mean, some of them are far more economic at one versus the other. Wind is clearly thought of as a large, centralized, utility scale solution, but you can do small wind on a distributed basis. Geothermal, same. Some people, when you say geothermal, think of the large geothermal plants that are somewhere near volcanic vents. To pull heat up out of the ground and use that to run a turbine. Other people think about ground source heat pumps used to do air conditioning, both heat and cooling, for distributed commercial and residential applications. Same with solar thermal. Some people think of large concentrating solar thermal power plants. Other people think about solar hot water on homes. Both centralized and distributed. PV obviously can be done the same. We're obviously focusing on solar today. We're going to focus on PV, and I really want to focus on distributed finance. Not that some of the things that we'll talk about aren't generalizable, but I really want to make it easy for us to get our head around, because there's so many free variables in talking about this that we need to kind of get our heads straight. And I think this is the most interesting part of the market, and it has a lot to do with some tax changes and tax characteristics that we'll talk about in a second. We have to talk a lot about who's the ultimate customer for the benefit that technology generates, whether it's heat or electricity. Let's think about it for these purposes in electricity. But who pays for that? Who's the actual person who's on the hook to pay for the ultimate benefit? Sort of the end of the value chain. Who's responsible for it? In some cases, and under some policy regimes, that's the utility. They're responsible for paying either a feed-in tariff or a reverse auction mechanism, agreed payment, or a power purchase agreement that they sign for 20 years for the benefit of that. Sometimes there's an integrator who's aggregating things up and taking on some of that risk. Often it's the end user customer, and you can think of the person on whose facility a distributed installation sits as being the person who's responsible for making the payment for the energy or electricity that's generated. And I really want to think about these structures, with the red characteristics. So PV distributed systems with distributed, where the customer is the off-taker of the value of the power, because that's going to help us really clarify our thinking around some part of the market, and then we can generalize from there. You also want to think about other aspects of energy finance, like who provides the capital. This gets really weird, because you'll have all these different structures for trying to move capital from the sources of capital into the projects, or think of that as the uses of capital. And the sources of capital can vary. I mean, they can be corporate balance sheets. They can be corporations who are looking for tax sheltering characteristics. They can be individuals. They can be the people who own the systems themselves. I mean, think about in the simplest version of the system, you think about energy finance as somebody who goes out, takes money out of their bank account and goes and puts a distributed PV system on their house. They're the one who is getting the benefit, but also providing the benefit as the distributed customer. They're the ones providing the capital. It's distributed PV. It's the simplest version of this, and they're implicitly financing this as a financial solution, right? They're implicitly making some kind of investment, just like if they'd taken that money and put it in GE stock. They just happen to have a different risk-return characteristic for that underlying investment. So energy finance happens in every one of these systems, but I want to think about specifically these types of energy investments, and hopefully we'll learn something about all the other characteristics. And certainly, no matter where you end up putting a system, you need to understand what incentives are available and what other characteristics, which we'll talk about for this. Is this a meaningful amount of money? Absolutely. The amount of project equity that goes in, and you can sort of look at, this is all of the sort of venturing corporate finance, and I don't count the public markets new equity. I think that's a kind of a spongy category. But certainly when you start to question valuations of that, how some of that money is going in. But the amount of sort of primary new capital for VC, corporate R&D, government R&D, and private equity in 2010 was around $12 or $13 billion. The amount of total investment in asset finance and SDC. We'll talk about what small distributed capacity is in a second, but that's the combined amount in actual projects is $188 billion. That number continues to grow pretty dramatically every year. We'll see some statistics on that. But but just sort of an order of magnitude larger in terms of the amount of capital going into this, and that makes sense because that's where the real capital is required in this industry. These people are hoping to own the IP that's monetized through this, but this is actually where the bulk of the actual dollars is going. So the difference between asset finance and small distributed finance. Let's talk about that for a second. Asset finance is finance that looks a lot like traditional project finance. It's large projects and they're sort of standalone entities that need some amount of project finance, both debt and equity that goes into them. Large utility scale systems are usually thought of in this way. And on the left, you can see kind of the asset finance totals, and you can see it by country. The United States is sort of putting tens of billions of dollars a year to work in all of the asset finance. That includes wind. In fact, it's a majority wind, but also a meaningful amount of solar. China, the green bar, climbing pretty dramatically up to $40-some billion, both wind primarily, but also some solar and a few other things. Europe, the red bar kind of climbed up and has dropped back a little bit as their underlying industry growth rate doesn't keep up with the falling prices. If you look at, and so that's kind of normal if you think about it, normal asset finance, project finance in a growing industry. What's really been amazing in this is the part of the market we want to talk about, which is this distributed finance, this SDC, small distributed capacity investments. And you can see that even in Europe, it started out pretty small back in the middle part of the last decade. And it's grown really dramatically. In the United States, I guess if you didn't have it on the same scale as Europe, would also show a very dramatic growth, order of magnitude or more in just a few years. And what this is this is the distributed finance we're really here to talk about. And I would argue that the more interesting part of this is actually not the European market. And the reason is that the European market it deals a lot with small systems that are on the customer side of the meter, but because of the nature of the support mechanism in Europe is a feed-in tariff, they end up looking a lot like project finance, bundled project finance things, which I think is where we need to go in the U.S. market. But I also argue that most of these people aren't self-consuming. They're what I refer to much of the German market as the Bavarian barn market, because they're putting 10 kilowatt systems, which is the max you can do for a small distributed system to get the maximum feed-in tariff rate allowed, on the south side of Bavarian barns. Bavaria having the best solar resource in Germany, barns being nice big empty places, but they're not using that amount. They're actually generating, so you're talking about a bunch of small 10 kilowatt power plants all over Bavaria feeding into the grid. That's not what I wouldn't consider that as true a small distributed capacity investment as somebody who's actually putting this on and then consuming the vast majority, if not more than 100% of the output of the system to meet their local residential or commercial needs. And this is also very interesting because this is the part of the market that's affected by the tax characteristics we need to talk about. So it's an interesting amount of money. It's growing dramatically, particularly on the distributed side. The other thing to think about is, this is actually a few years old now, from the Department of Energy and their solar technology program, which has sort of morphed into their SunShot initiative, around the range of levelized costs of solar system prices down into the single cents range by 2015, and massive market penetration. Both of these targets being met or exceeded in the 2 or 3 years since they were published. And so what we're seeing, is that the demand for the amount of capital going into these small distributed systems has been growing, but we're just getting to the point of, if you think about these as the residential and residential and commercial rates, we're just now getting into the range where you would think of this as in the normal grid parity sense, that we're beginning to achieve grid parity. And the amounts of capital are continuing to climb. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars in capital required. Even as the cost of the systems falls, the market's growing faster than the declination rate of the cost of the systems. So you're talking tens of billions of dollars across hundreds of thousands of residential and thousands of commercial systems that we need to figure out how to finance in some efficient manner. That's the nature of the problem. That's one of the aspects of the problem. The other will be the tax elements that we need to address. But this is just going to get larger and larger and larger. This is a map for those who have seen it before, probably those who are in my class. This map represents a look at grid parity in 2015, assuming that the only rebate available in the United States is the investment tax credit. We'll talk a lot about the investment tax credit today, but it assumes that a relatively limited fall in prices, probably on par with the prices that are expected in these cost targets, and it shows that by 2015, if the underlying grid electricity prices only go up by 1% per annum, something like 2/3 of the U.S. market will be below grid parity by 2015, and 99% will be within 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you ran this out at some more reasonable number, and we've seen substantially higher average rate increases over the last few years, then this map would be even more in the red, and red being the place where it's at or below grid parity. So this is a massive opportunity that we have just begun to scratch the surface. We're at less than 1% aggregate penetration, probably less than 0.5% of aggregate penetration. And 2/3 will be in grid parity before you can sort of blink. So this problem is going to get worse, not better, in terms of needing to access to capital in large amounts. So good to know. So in thinking about this notion that the levelized cost of solar is dropping, let's think about what the component parts of levelized cost of solar are. We look at this a lot in the class because it's important to understand how each of these components moves individually, but I think that the takeaway message for this argument, and the reason that I think we should be spending a lot of time in terms of optimizing our financial solutions for amortizing the cost at the lowest possible rate, is because if you look at the total cost of the current levelized cost of electricity, and you look at sort of the components, the red box here actually shows the amount of the physical capital, the $3 a watt per system that's projected in 2013. That is, if that's amortized over the lifetime output of the system, that's what levelized cost essentially does. And then the top two boxes, the green box right above it is the operating cost. That's the running cost, the maintenance cost, everything to keep that system running for the entire life of the system. And the top two boxes are the debt and equity finance costs. So if you think about it, 2/3 of the payments, of all payments that go into a solar, to pay for the LCOE or pay for the amortized cost of that system, however you want to think about that broadly, 2/3 of the payments go into the financial investment and only 1/3 into the physical capital. I would also argue that the physical capital has come down dramatically in prices. Those of you who are familiar with the solar industry prices, those prices have fallen in half in the last 18 months. They are continuing to get squeezed for a little while. And so I think that in terms of the total cost of installation, a lot of progress has been made. We're really stuck on the rest of this, and we need to come up with some new. In fact, we're moving in the wrong direction given some recent changes in the tax code, which we need to discuss. Here's a map of, say, some traditional project finance. This project finance, I want you to also understand that a lot of these projects are currently getting aggregated up into project finance pools, whether they are utility scale or whether they are distributed. A lot of them are getting aggregated up into these pools, usually being led by sponsor-level equity providers who are pulling together the required components, including the tax equity and the debt, in order to pay for the capital. But just to keep in mind, everybody below the project line here gets about 1/3 of the total rents of the project, and everybody above the line gets 2/3 of the rents on the project. Well worth considering. And what we're going to try to do is think about all the things that impact that and ways that we can kind of reduce it. So certainly we want to understand the cost of the asset, but beyond the cost of the asset, we need to understand some of the operating aspects of that and make sure that both the physical and financial calculus on that works. We need to understand the value of the offtakes and the electricity that it's generating, because that's essentially the revenue side of any financial calculus or model that you might build. And we need to understand how the costs of that capital are spread out over time. So these are all kind of, think about all the inputs. If for any of you who've spent time doing any financial modeling, all the inputs to kind of an investment return model that you want to consider. We're going to try to figure out where in there are some opportunities for optimization. Just to understand, this is a very cool chart that I pulled from the NREL website on sensitivities for the levelized cost to things like leverage, things like capacity factors, things like total installed costs. Most important being that leverage matters a great deal in bringing down the costs. So nothing to memorize here, but certainly interesting to understand that basically you want to see, in thinking about sensitivity analysis, you want to think about changing some of these model variables and where we're going to get the most benefit from doing so. So the last thing to understand before we really get at the problem or begin to start to think about the solutions is we really have to understand the nature of the problem. So the problem today is not that we have solar and that we were surprised that solar exists. A lot of people predicted, a lot of people have seen coming solar. We've seen many markets grow. Today it's a $50 billion a year global industry. Maybe even, it's probably up to 60 or 70 this year. We'll get the new statistics out probably in another few weeks. But the surprising bit has not been that in Europe, a lot of that growth, where a lot of that growth occurred because there was a highly certain revenue contract that allowed you to sell 100% of the output of your system, even if you then also bought back some of it at a different price. It allows you to sell a large amount of that output at a rate that allowed for a high return on invested capital, and that certainty around revenue allowed a lot of capital to flow in. And most of those markets have achieved growth well beyond what they expected. And we shouldn't be surprised that a number of manufacturers have come in to supply those markets because they are profitable markets. And so you've seen the emergence of German companies and American companies, followed by Chinese polysilicon manufacturers, followed by thin film manufacturers. Lots of people coming in, lots of supply, an inevitable oversupply, because supply tends to grow until it finds some market limit. It finally found some market limits. Prices have crashed. None of this should be a surprise. What's surprising is that in the United States, the way that that starting back in the kind of the middle part of the last decade, the way that the government decided to incentivize the development of this industry was to provide a couple of tax characteristics that would be beneficial. One is an investment tax credit, which is a mechanism that's been around for a very long time. But what they did is they basically said 30% of the project, value of the project, you can claim as an investment tax credit. What's an investment tax credit? It allows you to basically use the value that creates, the 30% times the total value of the project, and what the total value of the project is somewhat in dispute. But it allows you to then offset that against any other passive gains you may have, and so therefore you don't have to pay taxes on it. And they also allowed for what's called a modified accelerated cost recovery something. Something, I think that's the last word. But it basically allows you to accelerate the depreciation schedule, which, if you think about it in a funny way, is basically a loan from the government. It allows you to sort of not pay taxes in the early years. It's a zero interest loan from the government. You don't pay taxes in the early years because you get to accelerate your depreciation. You pay it back later when you would have otherwise captured depreciation under a normal schedule. So the combination of these two things were great, except they required the development of a whole new financial structure to take advantage of them, because usually the project entities themselves weren't able to take advantage of them. So lots of people sort of wrung their hands over this. How do we deal with this? The government's given us this free money, but we don't know how to take advantage of it. Along comes SunEdison. SunEdison developed a model which allowed for a multi-party transaction with the project company in the middle. Sorry, all the arrows are backwards. I just realized earlier. But it allowed basically for them to pay to have a project installed, borrow money from both a debt and an investment from a tax equity investor, and sell the output of that system to the end user who wanted the solar on their distributed sort of location, and then those payments would fund the waterfall of payments that have to be paid out through this structure that's been developed. Great innovation, and that innovation, it was basically the single sort of finance innovation that's occurred in the last 6 or 8 years that matters. Lots of companies in the commercial distributed space in the United States followed this. Companies that you know, Tioga, Solar Power Partners, I could name many more. And more recently in the residential market, companies like Sunrun, SolarCity, which does it both in the residential and commercial markets, have all come in with where they have put together these pools of capital designed to take some tax equity, some debt, and develop standardized relationships with the customers all the way, all the different customers they're going to engage with, and there's some compensation for that, including they own the residual value of the systems through the middle of it, but after the end of the payments and everything. So there's some value there that's being created, and everybody's better off. Well, along comes the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, and the primary source of the tax benefit, or the taxable gain that's used to offset these tax credits had been and still is predominantly in banks and investment banks. Well, guess who didn't have profit in those years? And so in a sort of an emergency so a couple of things. When Lehman went bankrupt, they put in a whole new package of incentives and funding to try to keep the economy going. One of the things, if you remember, there was a debate about there was a bunch of pork stuffed into the bills. They went through one pass, it didn't pass it, and went through a second one. There was a bunch of pork stuffed in the bills. Well, part of that pork was it extended this investment tax credit from what had previously been a 2 to 3 year kind of cycle of tax credits out through 2016. And then they realized that nobody was going to be able to take advantage of it because of the recession. So in the Recovery and Stimulus Bill, ARRA, the American Reinvestment Recovery Act, they advanced a provision called the 1603 cash grant, which said instead of actually going to some investment bank and monetizing this, you can actually just take it as a cash grant. Good news, right? So that was a 2-year provision, a 3-year. I think they extended it for 1 year. Yeah, so it's a 2-year provision originally. They extended it for 1 year through the end of December, or through December 2011. You could take a cash grant. Well, it's no longer 2011, and this no longer exists. So one of the big problems we have is that this cash grant has gone away, and people are going back to the market looking for tax equity to monetize this tax benefit, and they're finding it very difficult. We'll talk about that. But before we get there, so a couple things to understand about the nature of this tax structuring problem. So the first problem is it's really, really complicated. And it requires lots of lawyers and lots of individualization of these things. And it's got lenders, it's got the developer, it's got the tax investor. There's some waterfall cash flow stuff. The tax credits go off. It goes for like 99% and 1% in terms of the cash flows and the tax benefits until they achieve some hurdle rates of return, and then that flips to be 1090 the other direction. And good Lord. I mean, that's complicated, right? Complicated is bad. It's poison for efficient capital structures. So it does lead to complicated financial structures. It leads to some characteristics that are going to make it substantially more expensive, both to do and to own later. What it basically does is it causes you to have a much higher level of equity than you probably otherwise would, because you have both sponsor equity and tax equity in a transaction. So you really can only get about, on average, around 50% debt and 50% tax plus sponsor equity. And sponsor's that last guy that holds it. So you've got this layer of tax equity on top of it and this layer of debt at the very top. And that's not an efficient capital structure. I mean, Modigliani and Miller, I think, suggested it would be a much higher gearing ratio to be efficient. I think they won the Nobel Prize for that too. So, doesn't make it right, but does make it worth considering. It also introduces multiple counterparties. So there's like at least three people involved in every transaction. And for any of you who've ever prior to doing all this, I used to do corporate acquisitions. And so anytime, the more counterparties you add, you exponentially increase the number of things that can go wrong. I'm sure there's some exponential law in there. So but most importantly, if you've got a party in there who has the scarce resource, and in this particular case, access to the tax, to being able to sort of absorb the tax benefits, that taxable gain where you can take it, ends up being the bottleneck in most of the transactions. And that actually allows you to just be much tougher in your negotiation. It allows you to kind of absorb all the excess rents in the transaction. And it happens over multiple transactions, but eventually you get to have all the power in the transactions and all the pricing power. And that's definitely happened. On the debt side of the weighted average cost of capital, the term that you can actually have for the amount of debt, so the duration of it, actually ends up being substantially shorter than would be efficiently predicted. Which is usually predicted by the lifetime of the asset. So the actual term of the debt is much lower because debt tends to be gated by when the equity needs to kind of, in this particular case, usually debt gets paid out first and then equity. In this case, you've got this weird characteristic where you've got kind of benefits kind of flowing out, particularly since a lot of the benefits in the tax benefits that are kind of flowing out in the initial stages. So that really kind of clamps down how long debt's willing to stay in the transaction. So in some sense, it's very gated by the equity or the nature of the transaction. It's not as long as it should be, which means you're sort of amortizing the full cost of this over a much shorter period of time than you otherwise would be able to. They're very skeptical about those tax benefits. There's associated risks. There's other state-level tax benefits that they're often not comfortable with, like renewable energy credits or SRECs. They hate multiple counterparties, as I mentioned. And they really need scale over lots of transactions to help drive down their costs and get to the right cost of capital. So, I mean, this structure, this whole complicated structure, has ended up creating a set of problems around the weighted average cost of capital and the term and the gearing ratio that are not ideal. So this is all compounded by the fact that now that the cash grant's gone away, although the president sent his most recent budget actually suggested that they wanted to put that back in, and he's sort of written it into his new budget. So there is some chance that the cash grant will come back, which I'm not sure. I'm probably one of the least happy people about. I'm not sure I'm unhappy about it, but I'm not sure I'm happy about it either. We'll talk about sort of what perturbations that creates in the marketplace in a little bit. But most importantly, what you found is that with the expiry of the cash grant and basically everybody else in the market today turning to these tax equity providers, because remember, you didn't need these tax equity providers. You still had some complications around the debt structure, skepticism around the tax benefits and everything else, but it was made simpler because you didn't need this tax investor if you could take the tax credit all up front. But now the market is probably 5 times the size it was when that cash grant was put in. The amount of tax equity hasn't probably grown at all. In fact, it might have shrunk from 2006, 2007. And so you've got much more demand, much less supply, and all of a sudden you've got a massive bottleneck problem in that those who can get tax equity are paying through the nose, but most people just can't get it. going forward. So you've got an entire development and integrator community that is panicked about this and has no idea how to solve this problem. So what do? We need a solution that kind of looks past this problem, assuming for a moment that the tax equity, the cash grant doesn't come back. Assume, if you want to be more general about it, that eventually we're going to need some solution that isn't constrained by some of the problems that this structure has created. We need a solution that goes beyond tax equity to figure out how to monetize this in a far more efficient, far more effective, far lower cost way. Okay? That's the problem, and that's what we have to do. So what does that solution look like? So first, there's a number of elements to thinking about what would a finance solution look like. First, and I think particular to this conversation, you need to know how you're going to deal with the tax equity. And just because I say we need to be post-tax equity doesn't mean the tax equity goes away. But you need a way to deal with it that we have not yet anticipated or we're not currently using to deal with it. Because there's a tax benefit that's being provided, but we can't monetize it either cost effectively or at all using the traditional mechanism that we've developed. We need a radical new solution for dealing with that tax equity. A finance solution has to deal with all the risks around. Remember that project model with all those elements and that mental project model that we've got with the revenues and the costs and the performance characteristics? We'll talk about what those are in a second. But you've got to deal with those. In any financial solution. And each of the sort of the current financial solution deals with them in certain ways. But whatever solution you come up with has to anticipate all of those, because if you don't, it won't work. Some counterparty or the other is going to find it objectionable and it won't get done. So you have to anticipate those things and structure them into your financial structure. They need to be simpler, and they need, so that both because simpler is cheaper, but also for the sheer scale effects that you get from aggregating up large numbers of similar transactions or larger pools of similar transactions. The individual transaction sizes aren't really changing all that much, although we are getting a little bit bigger, but particularly on the distributed side, roofs aren't getting that much bigger, so you are kind of, in fact, the average transaction size is probably getting smaller, because the cost of the system per unit of capacity, cost per watt, is dropping, but the roof sizes aren't getting that much bigger. So you're getting more transactions of the same amount of power in a smaller aggregate, a smaller individual kit amount. So we're going the other direction. So we need to get even more simple, because we've got even more transactions we've got to aggregate up to get to the same dollar volume. We need to sort of think about accessing pools of capital with the correct risk-return profile. And I argue that tax equity investors are not the correct risk-return profile, and debt that's gated by tax equity is not the right risk-return profile. We need to get to other pools of capital that may be cheaper and longer term and better gearing ratios. And so where are those located? And we need to think about all the institutional structures that are required to support the perpetuation of a system of new financial tools. Because you can have a financial tool, we can design it, we can model it, we can all shake hands and agree that it's the right thing to do. But if you don't have the institutional underpinnings to give it the credibility or the scale or the heft to get large capital providers involved, then it's not really going to go anywhere. So let's talk about the risk characteristics that you want to think about in each of the transactions. I like to think of the risk bundled in the physical aspects and the financial aspects, and then there's usually some notion of what's left over after it's all done. So the physical characteristics are kind of the construction, quality of construction, that it's done right, it's optimized that it's maintained well to continue to perform over its entire project life. And then there's some notion of the pass-through manufacturer's warranty of the components that go into that system that you're often relying on. The financial performance is the revenue risk. We've talked a little bit about the offtake agreements and the creditworthiness of that off-taker party. Some of the cost that can change based on, sort of, yes, we may be able to physically maintain it, but it may cost more than we think it will. And then there's some other financial incentives and things that create some perturbations in the market, which we have to be a little sensitive to, because sometimes they can create value. I think quite often they can create confusion or uncertainty around the financial products, which so can, under some circumstances, do more harm than good. You also need to think about the collateral value, and this comes up in two places. One is you need to understand the terminal value, and this can be positive or negative, by the way. If you think about amortizing all of the costs throughout the lifetime and generating the revenue, then at the end of it, you've got something left over. You've got a physical something left over that needs to be dealt with. That can be worth something to somebody. You can resell it. It can be, you can have a scrap cost where you actually have to pay to have it taken off. But importantly, somewhere between here and the expected sort of end of life of the project, or end of life of the financial investment in the project, the assets may continue on after, but you also need to think about what would the value of the system be worth as collateral to a lender who needs to ensure that they've got multiple layers of certainty in their payment structures. And all of these things are risk characteristics that people will think about. And think about them again as the elements of the mental financial model that you want to consider. You want to think about the requirements of the available capital, and you want to think about sort of which capital do you want to use. Do you want to use equity? Do you want to use venture capital, which is the most expensive kind? Public equity, which is not cheap and only available under very extreme circumstances. You can use infrastructure or project finance, or can you go all the way to, say, a fixed income? They have different returns requirements. They have different sort of risk perceptions that you have to achieve in order to qualify to pay those implied costs of capital. They have different volatility elements. And so the less you can make it look like equity, and the more you can make it look like either infrastructure finance or project finance, the more you're dropping your costs, and the more you're decreasing your weighted average cost of capital. The longer duration of the term of the asset you're getting, and the better gearing ratio you're allowed to have. Again, simple. You want to focus on those three targets when going after improvements in the underlying capital structure. Okay. So let's talk about those 5 sort of elements of the solution pathway and see what opportunities are available today. Because this is about as far as, unfortunately, the industry's gotten, is a menu of the options. I'm not terribly satisfied with this, but but this is as far as it's gotten. This is why I felt like the Institute needed to step in and try to catalyze a conversation around this. And this is actually the first presentation of some of this information, so thank you for sort of being my guinea pigs, and I will welcome any feedback on it as either ways to present things or better information to make the points perhaps that I've made, or anonymous hate mail, or whatever it is you think is appropriate. Because I think this is an important conversation to have, and I'm having it with everybody from the DOE to venture capital firms who are trying to figure out how to deploy capital, some of whom own positions in PPA companies, with a number of banks, a number of intermediaries, et cetera. So any suggestions are welcome at this point, because I'm going to just keep churning until I can turn the cream into butter. Anyway, but let's talk about this menu of sort of how do we think about each of those elements. So first, we have to figure out how to manage the tax equity bottleneck. So there's a lot of structures for kind of dealing with the tax equity problem. Right now, we have a very limited sort of supply of tax appetite. It's these investment banks and people with a certain particular kind of passive tax gains that they can offset. So we need to fix that somehow. Now, there's lots of possible solutions in ways that we've seen in other industries. The one that's been talked about a lot is called master limited partnerships. These are investments in traditional finance of traditional energy assets, among a number of other things. They were used for real estate back in the 80s and 90s. But they're predominantly used for power assets these days. Probably 75 to 80% of them are used for power assets. But they're things like exploration or pipelines, or my guess is Keystone XL would have been financed using a master limited partnership. Now the problem is that for some reason, solar is not considered a resource under the master limited partnership tax code. Oil and gas are, coal is, but solar is, and wind and some of these new renewables are not considered resources that qualify under the Master Limited Partnership. To get that fixed requires a legislative change. Now, what would this do for you? It would basically allow you to create a partnership with a general partner and some limited partners. Each of those limited partners could aggregate up a bunch of capital. They could own shares in it. They could probably even be tradable under some circumstances. And it would allow so lots more people with tax appetite of the right kind to kind of band together in smaller chunks into very large pools. So sort of disaggregating the source of tax equity the same way you've got disaggregated uses of the project finance. But that's going to require legislative change in today's political environment, not terribly likely. I have some questions as to whether it actually helps to solve the problem, because I think all that does is expand the available pool of tax equity. I don't think it actually solves the structural elements of tax equity. The second change is a passive tax rule change, which basically means that you don't have to use these passive tax gains, or passive gains for tax purposes, as the offset. You can use income or a bunch of other things. So this is the way it used to be back in the 80s. We had a bunch of tax shelters, if anybody remembers real estate tax shelters and a bunch of other things. Those were allowed under the rules at the time. They put in some substantial protections, consumer protections around these, because some of those didn't turn out very well from the buyer's point of view. And they are today that you're not really allowed to, or the tax code's written in a certain way. To overhaul that is a non-trivial tax code overhaul, much harder legislative lift, if you will, even than what's expected to be a heavy lift for the master limited partnership structure. So, and again, I don't think it solves the problem. I think it just opens up the pool of available tax equity. That does solve the bottleneck problem, but it doesn't solve the structure problem. Other solutions. We could sell off the tax benefits. Now, this seems to make a lot of sense. Is there some way that you can actually just take them out of the transaction? You can sell them for cash in some easily compartmentable way and just finance the rest. There are analogs for this. There are some tax credits that are sort of resellable in this regard. But those markets are unique, and so we have to explore whether the same rules can apply here and what kind of legislative or executive rule change would be required to allow that. I mean, they tend to be very sort of industry by industry, but it is a possibility just to kind of segment. And I do think that solves the problem. And so we're going to be exploring that as an option. The real estate investment trust. So this is a way people can get together and bundle up a bunch of real estate. And you can buy strips in these. These are freely tradable. They're listed. And it really does allow for a much simpler, cleaner financial structure. Right now, there's some question as to whether the characteristics of the revenue generated from distributed solar generation or any distributed generation qualifies under the rules that make a real estate investment trust. This, however, probably doesn't require a legislative change. It probably requires some executive order or an IRS tax ruling letter around the treatment of the mortgage payment, if you will, of the solar system, to make it similar to the sort of the mortgage payments of the commercial buildings that are typically used or typically found in real estate investment trusts. So there's a way to potentially solve this, and a way to potentially solve this using an executive order. Interestingly, though, it's unclear whether this would require you to forego the investment tax credit altogether. So yes, there may be a vehicle that would allow you to do it much simpler and using a much more commercial sort of mortgage structure for your finance, but you'd have to forego the tax credit altogether. Now, a lot of people would argue you can't do that. I would argue that you'd have to look at the benefit created from extending the term, reducing your WACC, and improving your gearing ratio against the benefit of, against the cost of losing the sort of the present value of the tax characteristics from the ITC today. And I've run models on this, and it's not clear to me that it is more expensive. I just think it hasn't been done yet. And I think over time that this structure, and this is sort of one of the things as well, is that you could forego tax benefits altogether if you could just mortgage it. Or even better, you could create a structure where you essentially you can self-shelter or self-liquidate the tax benefits in the project over time. The problem is that you have to wait until your accelerated depreciation is taken out, and you have to wait, so you don't actually get to recapture it until year 10 through 25 in the project. And so the net present value of it's very low. But again, I argue that in all three of these cases, it may be worth foregoing any or the bulk of the value in the ITC because of the improvements in the underlying capital structure. And remember, 2/3 of your total payments are dictated by the amount in your capital structure. So I think that we need to start exploring a set of solutions that look a lot more like that in terms of managing the tax equity bottlenecks, because everything else is going to force us down the same contorted path that I don't think gets us the revolution, the new generation of financial thinking that's required. Okay? In order to do any of these, but particularly anything that begins to smack of disintermediation, you understand disintermediation is where you're starting to remove counterparties from direct contact from each other. Things are getting more sort of anonymous. You need certain things to help the transactions retain their integrity. And you certainly need module performance, but since there's going to be lots of different module manufacturers supplying lots of different projects, you may need to true them all up to some level of certainty, and you may need to do that with some insurance product. That if you want to bid into this pool, you're going to need you're going to need to pay an insurance premium, and you'll have third-party insurers telling you what the cost of that is based on the fundamental risk that your company and your balance sheet represent. So same with the people who install the components. They're not all well known. You're going to need some. We'll talk about institutional structures for determining quality, sufficient quality, and everything else. But you're going to need some. You may need some insurance, or certainly some assurance that everything is trued up to some minimal level of certainty that it's designed correctly, installed correctly, and will perform over its lifetime. And who's going to maintain that, and some certainty around that as well. And you can do ongoing maintenance and stuff through a payment contract, and if they stop performing, you stop paying and you pay somebody else. But a lot of this comes to sort of what's the original design and installation, as well as the ongoing operations and maintenance. Whoever is paying. So if you think about sort of disintermediated mortgage markets, you pay different rates depending on what the credit rating of the pool of assets is. And so you can either deal with sort of differences in the revenue stream quality by creating different pools of capital, or you can do it by truing up the risk by some credit insurance. But some way you've got to sort of get these things. Remember, in all these cases, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create as standardized a characteristic in the model so that they look effectively similar to each other and can be bundled into much larger pools of capital. That's the whole play here in terms of trying to get these transaction risks addressed for each individual transaction to homogenize them. And we talked about the secondary markets, or sort of the collateral markets. It helps a lot to have an established secondary market, both for if you just need to resell the electricity, and right now that's somewhat problematic on a distributed generation base, because right now you can't sell the electricity to anybody except the person whose facility it sits on without violating the Fuqua rules or the PURPA rules or one of those rules. And the utility doesn't usually want to buy it back, but you need some established secondary market to the extent that you can move if someone stops paying, you can sell the output. Or in the worst case, if someone stops paying, you can take the equipment and you can go sell the equipment to somebody else. But in some way, you need some additional collateral coverage for the value of the system, either in the value of the electricity or the components themselves. So then the other thing is we've got to reduce the transactions cost. So we've now got a mechanism to deal with the tax equity problem. We've got all the risks kind of banded together, so they're looking all pretty homogeneous. Now we've got to do a lot of them efficiently. And that's what I mean by sort of reducing the transactions cost. So there's a number of ways you can sort of get at this, none of which is simple. So to take the second one first, the first and easiest way is somebody decides to put up a pool of capital. They buy up all these standardized risks, knowing that they've got, or hoping in some cases, that they've got somewhere to move it off to on the other side. They buy up a bunch of similar things, they package them together, they sell them off. The implied rate at which they sell it off is better than the implied rate at which they sold it to the other folks, and there's an asset value pickup, and so this happens, by the way, this happens today. And that's essentially thought of as warehousing these projects. So you're sort of building a big financial warehouse and you're stuffing them in, and you sell somebody the full warehouse when it's done at a better rate than you paid for each of the individual ones. So fair way to do business. There's other more complicated structures. In particular, there's this notion of a sponsored program. These tend to be grouped around municipalities which want to deploy a lot more solar or distributed energy or even energy efficiency. And so in the energy efficiency space, you have this PACE financing, which is property assessed clean energy, or property assessment for clean energy or something. So you're using a mechanism where the municipality can raise money to pay for the systems. The consumer wants to put in the system. So the utility pays for, or the municipality pays for the system, puts it on the consumer's home, and remember, this could be distributed generation or distributed efficiency. And then the person who's getting the benefit on their home pays through the property tax mechanism, which is senior to any mortgage in the capital structure. So in a very efficient, very easy existing mechanism that's senior to any other claims, they pay back the monthly charge for that system. Super efficient, super low cost. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac puked on this about 2 years ago and said, no, can't do it. The Obama administration didn't back them up. This is now coming back to do again. For those who think of PACE as primarily energy efficiency, I want you to remember it was actually started as a solar program in Berkeley. Was the original PACE model. And even today, the amount of money that these programs are hoping to put into solar actually exceeds the amount they want to do in energy efficiency. But the Carbon War Room, which I helped develop the program and launched at the Vancouver Olympics, does a large commercial PACE program where you go into cities and have them sort of finance energy efficiency and all the other stuff. There's a lot of work around PACE, but essentially from the point of view of what we're talking about now, we're really talking about these sponsored programs where you can aggregate up lots of these similar things with similar characteristics in some kind of nice aggregator fashion. Think of it as a city-sponsored warehousing component with a much better offtake capital structure because they can use tax-free municipal bonds in many cases to do it. You can also think about tradable exchanges as ways to kind of like, as a method of aggregating it, or having a place to move off your loans if they meet a certain characteristic. You could find some other metric of warehousing, some slightly more disintermediated way of warehousing by having an exchange where someone would take up things with certain characteristics and would take as much as anybody can provide meeting those characteristics. Eventually, I think most of this wants to sort of move toward a notion of securitization. So securitization is kind of the end point. I think it sounds like I've talked about in my class, smart grid. It's sort of this ephemeral end point. It doesn't describe something very technical. Although in securitization's case, it's pools of very similar characteristics that have very specific requirements for going in the pool. They can strip them into different classifications, either risk classifications or underlying off-taker characteristics or location or whatever it is. They can even strip the risks so that you can get first risk, second risk, third risk elements, and you can slightly change the risk-return characteristics for different people who might want to take strips of this. So these become very sophisticated markets. And do they matter? Absolutely. The United States in the first quarter of 2011 issued $265 billion worth of securitized new issues. Now, 240 of that was mortgage-backed securities. We're still doing those, you believe it? But $20 billion in the quarter was not, right? And so there were credit cards, and there were auto loans, and there were some other things in there. But you're talking about, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars just in the U.S. available for that not mortgage-backed security piece of the marketplace. Lots of capital. And by the way, I argue that the risk characteristics of these, the risk-return characteristics on these underlying assets, far better than mortgage-backed securities, which means that you could peel off some amount of that capital as well. There's essentially a near limitless supply of capital already flowing through the securitization market. There's all kinds of, well, I know you can't read this very well, but these are different sort of structures of transaction sizes and how much, you know, time it takes to set up and how much risk and how standardized and all the other stuff of different ways of doing securitization. You know, and essentially, you know, all they're doing is they're lumping these together and then stripping them off and paying out those characteristics to people in a very standardized way. And so that's the idea, is that really simplifies it, really, and it allows for the market to kind of work its way through to what's the correct risk-return profile, what's the correct term, what's the correct gearing ratio, and you know, and in the end, sort of what are the other elements of the transaction required to make them standardized enough to be able to sell to the broad marketplace. So very cool, very important sort of endpoint. And the good news is this is not, this is plowed ground. This is plowed ground to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a quarter, just in the United States alone. So there's a huge pool of capital available. There's actually massive amounts of aggregate capital available. If you look at the amount of money in the global fund management, there's tens of trillions of dollars in pension funds, each of pension funds, mutual funds, insurance funds. There's another $40 trillion just in private wealth. All of these people, many of these people, allocate substantial amounts of money into today's securitization market, probably willing to do more if you could give them an extra 100 basis points, which would make these projects far cheaper than they are today. So, and my argument is that properly structured, no more risk. In fact, I would say less risk than mortgage-backed securities have shown in the last 36 months. So the last thing, let's assume we can do all of this stuff. Let's assume we can figure out how to deal with the tax equity. We can aggregate these things up. We can make them, you know, low-cost transactions. We can tap into large pools of capital. What else do we need? We need standardized documentation. Who's responsible for that? It's going to be whoever's the intermediary responsible for kind of aggregating these up, the warehouser, the financial intermediary, the investment bank, whoever it is that's sort of responsible for pulling this stuff together. And they need loan documentations, operations and maintenance agreements, offtake agreements, collateral agreements, FCC filings, all the other things that you would do inside a normal transaction. Some of them unique to the fact that these assets tend to sit on other people's real estate, creates a slight complicating factor. I'd say if that's the problem we're having and we've solved all the other things, we're pretty close to completion and we can probably work through it. But not, I wouldn't say, you know, I mean, security issues are funny things, but they can be dealt around. You need quality standards for installations. Who does that? There's a bunch of possibilities, but it would require, to get the existing kind of inspection agencies and qualification organizations up to speed is no small task. So you're going to need, there are third-party firms that'll go in and do it now, but it's still going to be expensive because they're doing sort of, they're very specialized and they have to travel long distances and they don't get good efficiency or scale on this. But it is possible. And by the way, for all of you that have bought a house, you just map this to the notion of buying a house, right? Did anybody read all that documentation that they shoved in front of you? And it's just pages and pages and pages. And like, what are you going to do? You're going to say, yeah, I don't like this term in clause 37 on page 22. OK, next. So there's a whole package of standardized loan documents. Somebody has to come out and do an inspection on your house, right, to make sure that it meets minimum requirements. Somebody has to do an appraisal. This is another version of that. Then your credit rating will go into some, into the calculus of your interest payment, which basically sort of passes through to which pool of securitized assets you're going to be a member of based on your underlying credit rating. So you need a good rating methodology, which is actually easier in the residential market where they have good FICO scores. But in the commercial market, there's not an analog for that really yet for very small commercial installations. So we need to develop something that's suitable to all the participants. And you need some legal and tax guidelines just to make sure that it's handled in the same way consistently every time. So those are the kind of the institutional structures you want to think about that have to go into what I think of as cementing this as a channel that can then handle the velocity of funds that are going through it. Next steps. Last slide. What do you do? OK, so let's say we all agree that I just said really smart things. So what? What do we do next? So I think that the correct way to think about this is actually, and I talk about this in the class a lot, so apologies to students who've taken my class, go to the very last customer. So who's the very last customer of finance? It's basically who holds the paper, right? So go to them, and go to the people who have those, those large pools of capital we talked about. Figure out what characteristics they need specifically to make these to do transactions that have the correct term, WACC, gearing ratio. What parameters do they need to get comfortable with those assets, and work backwards from there. So then you work backwards to figure out kind of what structuring elements will allow you to efficiently aggregate up the volume that meet the needs of that last customer. So this is very different than the process that a lot of people are going through today, which is they're going to the current, they're going from today's structure, and they're going to the people who are providing today's structure and saying, what innovations can you make to make this better? They're asking PPA providers to essentially create an evolutionary PPA structure. And I'm thinking of a sort of go to the end of the supply chain and work backwards to try to figure out what's the structuring, sort of what's the characteristics, and then what are the structuring elements to get things into those characteristics. If they tell you you've got to get the tax equity out, then you've got to get the tax equity out, because they're the ones that are going to be taking off hundreds, if not hundreds of billions, if not trillions or tens of trillions of dollars eventually of this paper. So my guess is that whatever solution you come up with probably requires a standardized method of dealing with the tax equity that gets it out of the transaction. I can't imagine you can standardize the tax equity characteristics inside the transaction. I'm open to suggestions, but I just can't figure out how to do it. I think you've got to either get it out, eat it yourself, or ignore it altogether. Otherwise, which is unfortunate, because I think that what is happening is we're talking about doing the cash grant again, which is only delaying our need to make the necessary transformations in this. Every time you propose new policy, particularly new policy that's better than the existing policy, like cash grants where everybody thinks the cash grants are going to go away, you actually slow down market deployment, because people are unsure whether there's more free money later than there is now, and so they will wait. And so the mere suggestion that we may put the cash grant back in, I argue, has slowed the industry down, not sped it up. And so I think we need to pay the piper. PV system prices have fallen dramatically in the last 18 months. We have an oversupply for another year or two. I think we're going to have a lot of pricing power when it comes to buying components. And I think that the risk-return ratios here are really good. I think now's the time that we get onto a new structure that allows for, instead of single-digit billions, we're talking single-digit trillions of dollars to flow into this industry. And that's where, and if you ever get lost, think about what the commercial mortgage market looks like, because it's already there, it already exists, and all we have to do is replicate something that looks like that. So we have analogs to follow, and we have pathways that we can tap into going forward. So that's my view on distributed renewable, particularly PV finance. But I think that a lot of this is generalizable. I think once you have a standardized structure, you can then changing one element like the technology risk becomes a lot easier than trying to simultaneously change the technology and the financial structure. So I think this, not unlike PV has done for distributed generation, sort of net metering laws and interconnections and even the current version of finance, it's really sort of forged a path for lots of technologies to flow in behind. So I think no matter which technology you support. If it's distributed, you really want a solution like this to exist as an analog or a vehicle for you to find capital for your technology as well. So I think that this is one that needs to be worked on not just by solar people, but by everybody, because I think it allows for the real value that these technologies create to be spread over the correct time, with the correct risk pricing, which is better for everybody. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
So you talked a little bit about the maintenance risks, and in particular for like a photovoltaic installation. That seems pretty straightforward, right? You have a system that's going to be distributed, but ultimately it's going to be outputting on the grid. So if either the system's going to be on or it's off. Kind of the vision for where things are going is we're talking about systems that potentially are operating in not so simple of a way. So for instance, like an energy storage or a different kind of project where the operation of the system is a risk in and of itself, not just keeping it maintained. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on that side of things as far as what you've seen for quantifying risk around operation, not just for...
Yeah, okay, so let me repeat the question for those who may be listening who didn't hear it. Today's PV systems have a very low operation and maintenance risk element to them. It's not as much of a deal killer, although it's worse. It's worse than you might think, because the performance of these systems can degrade pretty rapidly, either because they were installed incorrectly in the beginning, or the components weren't up to quality that the manufacturer may have hoped, or because they're not maintained well over their life. It's more in the performance degradation where you'll see a lot of that risk than the actual, maybe the cost to maintain it. So there's a lot more risk than you think, although all of it's manageable. None of it, I think, as you said, is none of it's really mind-bendingly complicated for how to manage it. Though, as these distributed systems get smarter and smarter and smarter, which if you follow the argument that the power is moving towards the ends of the system as opposed to being centralized, they will. They'll include sort of some smart metering elements to allow for communication to the grid. They'll allow real-time pricing elements. They'll allow storage, as you mentioned. So as these get more and more complicated, how do you bring those in? I think those are all good things to think about, but I would think about them in the same way as do the elements add revenue potential, so economic value on the top line? What's the cost? How is that cost amortized? Is it amortized in the same cost of the system? What's the O&M component of that? And where you'll see a lot of the risks will end up having to do with the revenue uncertainty that some of those additional benefits might bring. So things like, what's the utility going to pay you for using your car as an ancillary service backup for the grid that runs through your system, and it's your smart meter and charge element that enables that. How much are you going to get paid for that? Is that wrapped into the value of the system that's and so where you draw the line on the systems and how do you get paid for it is an important element to think about. But my guess is that most people who are looking at finance innovation in this are probably going to want to go with the dumbest, simplest version in the first iteration. What you want is something that, because unlike energy efficiency even, this generates something that can be metered. And so you have this very clear transaction of kilowatt hours generated times of value for each kilowatt hour equals total cost. And then in some of the transactions, that's estimated and then made actually a gross payment, which is even less risky in some sense. It sort of moves the risk of performance off to the customer as opposed to the integrator or whoever's maintaining the system. So there are ways to deal with this, but you want them in the initial iteration. In order to develop all those other elements we talked about, you want the simplest possible revenue transaction so that you don't introduce those risks. And then once that's established, you can go back and add more complicated things that are sort of value additive net of the risks.
Yes, sir. So, Travis, it's a really unique way to think about it, and I'm really glad I came. But
I'm glad you're here.
I'm starting to think now, if the U.S. solar panel companies are having such an issue being able to compete, I wonder why they haven't made much more of an effort to try and be a pipeline company as well. Because if there's opportunity here to kind of create efficiencies in the financial markets, it would be beneficial for them to be a B2C customer, to go right out and try to outcompete these solar cities of the world.
Well, so the question is if the U.S. firms are having trouble competing abroad, why aren't they using their sort of domestic position to go and fill this marketplace? So that's exactly what SunPower did, right? If you think about SunPower's evolution, one of their early innovations was they bought Powerlight, which was a domestic, a residential and commercial integrator, and that was very much part of their model. They have a particularly high efficiency, high value technical solution that they felt they could best monetize by selling kilowatt hours as opposed to watts. And so that was very much their intuition in the initial stages, and I think that's worked out very well for them. In fact, I think they're quite glad that they have that systems integration business that goes down, even all the way down to the residential level, particularly as margins have gotten squeezed on the component business. A couple of others, like First Solar, absolutely have a domestic development arm. But they have chosen to go after large-scale projects where they can get the volume up to fill what in their case was one of the fastest global capacity ramps of components, and take advantage of their truly low-cost manufacturing position. So they've gone after a different part of the market. And they even bought pipeline in order to do their own kind of flux to keep their capacity absorption, or their factory absorption, or their high, because they could keep their capacity factors in their factories really high. And so they did it for a slightly different reason. The others, foreign module manufacturers have bought their way into the U.S. market. A number of the Chinese firms have made some small recent acquisitions. SunTech bought EI Solutions, and Sharp bought Recurrent Energy. So a number of foreign producers have bought domestic integration capacity here as well. But a lot of them have been going after that large-scale market, and not many of them have done what you suggested, which is go after the mid to low the sort of the commercial distributed or the residential market. It'll be interesting. I think the logic is there that's where if you really want to be a large-scale, low-cost producer, you're going to need to be selling into all markets. And what's their go-to-market strategy? Maybe they've decided that it's more effective for them to let other people do that sort of small-scale distribution and finance better. But the Chinese firms themselves have come in most recently, and this is part of what the trade actions against the Chinese producers are, is that they came in with financing options to wrap the whole system projects. That may be deemed unfair trade practices from a manufacturer to do, but it does continue, and we see examples of it, and how it all works out. So, I think that's part of the flux right now. I don't think we haven't had the oversupply and distributed grid parity hit so powerfully simultaneously before, and so that may very well be the next phase in the industry evolution. Oh, time for one more, sir.
I own a little solar energy company in Chapel Hill. I started a couple years ago, and I started it on 1 month, and the next month, a company called SunEdisons, which used to buy solar renewable energy credits, decided that they were going to withdraw from North Carolina. And it left our industry with really only two options. One for residential folks that can go to NC Green Power. You get 10 cents a kilowatt hour from them, but you can only put a 5,000 watt or 5 kilowatt system on your house. So the bids I do are all now stopping at 5, because as soon as you go 5.1 kilowatts, a residential customer has no solar renewable energy credits left anymore.
Right.
But we've had the pleasure of working with John Galt here as a MBA student. And I've asked him to look into third-party financing for both residential, commercial, and municipal. And I think you've got 5 companies you're in discussion with right now. And so far, he's talked to all 5 of these. They seem to have what appear to look like attractive programs for financing. But not one of them has an installation in North Carolina.
So the question is sort of that there are some unique characteristics in North Carolina where the SREC program or some local incentives are capping the size of the system, and simultaneously there are very few people who've come up with good financing solutions that are available in North Carolina. So those may be related, they may be independent, and so I did mention sort of briefly when passing through. That I think that the state level incentives create a very complicating element. If you've got, it's basically an anathema to the ability to aggregate up the volume of systems that you need to get the cost down to go after these small kind of SREC programs. They're big to the value of the individual systems. They're very constraining, but I think my arguments around the limits that the ITC create and the potential need to just sort of forego the benefit, air quotes, benefit of the ITC apply to the SREC markets as well. And in New Jersey, where SREC prices are, have collapsed, one of my arguments is they may have collapsed because the market's done its job and it's brought prices down where they're not necessary to clear the market anymore. The finance issue may be related to that because it's just too complicated for them to get their head around for too small a pool of potential installations. But it also might just be related in that they can't get the economics to work under their current cost of tax equity and their current structure versus the value of the electricity being created that gets you a price that your customers are willing, right? There may not be surplus value added in there. So 2 ways to solve that problem, 3 ways to solve that problem that don't include additional policy mechanisms. One is that system prices continue to drop. 2 is that the financing costs allow you to spread those costs over more, so the cost per unit of your electricity drops because you spread over more years or electrons or at a lower cost of capital. Or you can just wait for electricity prices to rise. Eventually, the combination will achieve this notion of grid parity, and hopefully by then, we'll have much better financial solutions that are more broadly applicable, and you can join larger pools of capital. That's part of the problem I'm trying to solve is this sort of this segmentation or unique characteristics of the state markets. I honestly think most of the dollars that go into the ITC and the state programs we far better spend in creating these warehouse pools of capital or some additional loan guarantees or something on top of that. I did actually show. Did you know the bulk of the loan guarantee program actually went into project finance? For those of you who didn't, this whole argument about Solyndra. Solyndra is one of the 8% in terms of the amount of capital that went into the loan guarantee program for solar what they call the pool of solar manufacturing capital. 74% of that went in of the loan guarantee program went into lending against systems, just sort of pure solar systems. And now most of that went into utility scale systems. I would argue that would have been far better suited or far better used if it were to set up a vehicle for sort of or to create loan programs that would help to bring down the cost of finance for much more distributed, sort of much more widely applicable system components and sizes. I think that that's, if we want to think about good uses of policy dollars, that's where we need to be thinking about. And then hopefully you can still, if North Carolina still wants to incentivize systems on top of that, they can create an incentive that doesn't change the structure or doesn't get baked into the financial model necessarily underneath, but it just becomes additive on top. And I think but using a new sort of securitized, government-backed loan program would be a great way to sort of standardize this across as many jurisdictions as possible and helps you solve that problem. So, all right, well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. And I'm definitely open to help or assistance on thinking about the future of this that anybody wants to provide.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.